Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
Gabrielle Winder sat in a quiet booth towards the back of Sackers, a local bar and grill just outside her hometown of Plainview, Arkansas, near Nimrod Lake. It was the 23rd of August. The time was 8:30. She knew the ritual. This was the 6th year in a row she had sat in this booth and waited for the clock to strike 8:39, so she could tell him all about the year and maybe say goodbye. Glancing slowly around the interior of the local watering hole, Jacob Billing, known locally as the Bear, plied his ministrations to the top of the White Oak Bar. He was the owner, bartender, and bouncer of the establishment. She looked past where he was standing, her eyes drawn to the methodical movement of color in the windows behind where he stood. For as long as Gabrielle could remember, the Budweiser sign, blaring its neon red greeting, had competed for attention with the blue and gold Coors sign in the front two windows. She always felt the two signs made the front of the place look like a weird Christmas display year-round. Her eyes returned to Bear, who at a glance seemed to be haphazardly running the rag in his hand over the flat surface, but upon closer inspection, one could pick up his careful, loving, almost tender care in everything he did for his establishment. Gabrielle chuckled a bit. Her father had told her once it was as if the bar was his wife, and he went about to ensure her happiness in all he did. She noticed the young kids in the first booth up by the bar as they got up to leave. Probably a summer romance. She took them both for no more than high school freshmen or sophomores. That left the guy in the booth 2 up and across from her as the only other person in the place. A stranger that wasn't at all unusual for this time of year. It was a very slow night, for which she was glad, sighing heavily. She sipped on her beer, the first legal one Bear had ever served her. Gabrielle was going into her senior year of high school when her life changed. She was just a youngster starting to grow into her womanhood back then. She had gone from being a shy, skinny kid with long, straight black shoulder-length hair and dark brown eyes, to the way her body had developed. Now at 24, her body was sleek and well-defined. She had worked hours at toning it. She was 5 feet 7 inches, 128 pounds, and although not model material, she would turn heads in any crowd. The raven black hair that flowed aimlessly to the middle of her back and dark brooding eyes were the only hints of her Cherokee Indian heritage, something she was, and always had been, extremely proud of. As she sat in quiet contemplation, the memories came cascading back without provocation, hanging all about her like humidity on a hot summer day. She gave in, letting herself drift back to that night 6 years ago. "Grebs, wait up," she heard her best friend Kirsten Tinnery yell over to her. "Well, hurry up, slowpoke," she laughingly replied. Kirsten, he had been her best friend and buddy since his family had moved into the farm across the road from her family when they were both 6. Grebs was his very own private nickname for her, and she would only allow him to call her that. Kirsten was a likable guy, though a tad bit skinny. He was actually well-muscled at 5 feet 11 inches, 175 pounds, light brown hair and sparkling hazel eyes. He and Gabrielle had done everything together, growing up: fishing, hunting, cooking, cleaning house, playing baseball, basketball, and tennis, as well as playing card games. They had joined 4-H, learned to ride horses and care for livestock together, and with their parents, who were also good friends, had hiked, camped, canoed, and learned about nature with each other. During the summer, both kids looked forward to the family campouts at Nimrod Lake. Only 5 or 6 miles from their houses, the lake offered the friends time to explore and discover a completely new universe in the paradise setting. That special year had been a turning point in their relationship. They were both preparing to enter their sophomore year of HS in the fall. By June, they realized they had fallen in love with the other. Both of them understood that what they now felt towards each other was much deeper and richer than it had ever been before. Their parents were supportive of the relationship once they discovered their kids had become an item. Not one of the parents understood exactly how deep the bond between their children had become. Kirsten was the first guy to hold Gabrielle's hand, the first to hold her and whisper lovers' secrets in her ear, given her the first kiss as well as her first French kiss. In early August of that same year, they shared themselves with one another for the very first time and became lovers, happening as it did out in the Tinnery's field, under their favorite tree. Kirsten, true to form, had held her after that first time, reassuring her of his love, after which he asked her in all truthfulness if this meant he could take her to homecoming in October and prom in the spring. Then before she could answer, he asked if this meant they were going steady. When she said yes to all three, all the boy could do was grin ear to ear. She thought it was so cute. By the evening of the August 23rd, the young lovers had been together 4 times. They had made some time to be together that day, and for some reason it had seemed very special, almost as if they had become one that afternoon. Since the two families were enjoying the last week-long campout by the lake of the summer, they asked their parents if they could go up to Sackers for a root beer. Her dad said, "Okay." As they walked towards the small bridge that separated the campsites from the bar and grill area, Kirsten stopped and kissed Gabrielle. There was raw passion in that kiss mixed with unbelievable tenderness. "When they broke," Gabrielle asked, "not that I mind, but what was that for?" "Ever since we made love today, I can't believe how close to you I feel, how special it was today. I mean, every time has been wonderful, but today was so beautiful." So I wanted to just crawl inside your skin and be part of you. Curson's smile lit up her whole world. She brushed the hair out of his eyes. I know it was that way for me too today. She kissed him again, just to watch his eyes sparkle. Just as they crossed a bridge about a quarter-mile from the bar, Curson kissed her again, then they exchanged I love yous and he said, I have to pee. You go on ahead. I'll catch up in a moment. She walked aimlessly along the river path towards the bar, the low-hanging branches brushing against her head and face. She waved to Betsy, Mr. Bear's niece, as she sat on the back steps of the tavern. Gabrielle suddenly screamed as a pair of rough hands grabbed her. Looky what I got, Tommy. After we knock over the store, we have something to play with tonight. A sickly voice resounded in her ear. Another voice said, look on the steps, another one. Gabrielle bit the hand over her mouth and screamed, Becky, run, get help, hurry. At the same time, her captor yelled, you little witch. She watched a hand move towards her face and remembers hearing Curson's voice. He was screaming something, then all was black. Gabrielle woke up in the hospital about an hour later. Her mom and dad were with her. Comforting her, she had asked, where's Curson? Her mom got a funny look on her face and looked up at her dad, who swallowed very hard. Fear gripped Gabrielle's mind. She started shaking her head side to side and asked again in a tear-filled voice, where is my Curson? Daddy, where is he? Her father took her in his arms and held her. Baby, he was shot and killed by the men that attacked you tonight. He was protecting his friend, the girl he loved. I'm so sorry, honey. Gabrielle tried to understand. She tried to speak, but her mouth wouldn't work except to cry as she held her daddy and her mommy as they put their arms around her to comfort her in her time of loss. Sometime later that night, Curson's mom and dad came in, and all Gabrielle could do was hold them and cry some more. At that moment, no one realized how devastating the loss would be. Gabrielle was shaking as she brought herself back to the present. She glanced around. No one was looking at her. She was weeping quietly. Looking at her watch, she noted she still had 5 minutes. She sighed and let her mind wander back. She remembered that over the next month, she slowly pieced together the circumstances of the next few minutes after she was rendered unconscious. Becky told her, you yelled, then the guy holding you punched you in the head and you fell to the ground. One of the guys started coming towards me when Curson charged them with a boat, or he picked up from a rowboat someone tied up near the path. He yelled, get away from them. Then smacked the guy charging me in the head with the oar, giving me the time I needed to get inside and get my uncle. Mr. Bear told her. He responded to his niece's screams by grabbing a shotgun. Then he sent 2 of his customers whom he knew had rifles in their cars to get them and circle either side of the bar. Watching through the back window, he saw Curson charge the remaining 2 men, smacking the first man, the one who they later learned had hit you, with the shank of the oar on his knee, then twirled around hitting the last guy in the ribs with the edge of the paddle. His attacks were startling and brutal, as both of those men moved as rapidly as they could down the path away from the 2 of you. Curson glanced quickly around. Finding no more danger, he dropped the paddle, then started to bend down towards you. He suddenly stopped and seemed to stiffen, then stood up and took a step towards the bar. Mr. Bear continued, a catch in his voice clearly evident. I looked down in horror and saw the first guy who Curson had saved Becky from. He was now standing, his right hand covering a bloody wound on the side of his head that he had received a moment earlier. His left arm outstretched pointing towards Curson. The man was holding a gun. Curson took a step towards him. I think to get between you and the gunman. The man screamed something and then fired twice. Both bullets struck him in the stomach. I moved to grab the doorknob and glanced at the clock. It was 8:39. Then I flung the back door open. The guy that had shot Curson looked up the steps at me, then started to swing his gun towards me. I unloaded both barrels into his head and chest. He didn't have a chance. As I started to move out to get to Curson, who was now on his knees and one arm holding himself up, his other arm around his stomach, suddenly 2 bullets slammed into the doorframe beside me. It seemed the other 2 goons were shooting at me. I moved back into the bar. The all boys I had sent out to get their guns opened fire with their hunting rifles while I reloaded the shotgun. There was a long silence as a lone "I give up" echoed into the night, and one of the 2 remaining rowdies came into the light with his hands on his head. We quickly found out that one of the fellows with the rifles had found his mark. 2 of them were now dead. No one moved for a second, and then the night lit up with the sounds of sirens. It seems Becky had called the sheriff. One of my buddies took control of the man who had surrendered. Becky and I got to you 2 a moment later. Curson had just said something to you. I've been over pulling him up on his knees, leaned him into my chest so Becky could get some of the towel she had brought onto the wounds to stop the blood flow. He looked up and asked me to tell you goodbye, and that he both loved you and knew you loved him. Your parents had heard the ruckus at your campsite, came running up to us just as the sheriff arrived. He lasted until 8:51, but he got to say I love you and his goodbyes to his parents. They were holding him when he died. Your parents got to you by then. They were cradling you as life left him. He was holding your hand when he died, honey. Bear concluded his story. Gabrielle opened her eyes as she whispered, Curson, I wish you would have held on so I could have said goodbye. It was 8:39. She felt a twinge of regret, but for some reason she was more comforted this year than before. Oh well, she thought. Time heals all wounds. She sat and told him all about the year the goings-on in her house and his parents' house, including the wonderful news that his parents had been approved to adopt the twins they had been foster parents to for the last 3 years. Also, wonder of wonders, his mom had allowed her to go into Kirson's old room, box up everything, repaint, and redecorate it since the twins were girls. Running out of things to say, she just sat and thought about her bestest friend and how much she missed him. Then it was over, at least for another year. She could go on with her life. Becky waited until Gabrielle sighed and started to lift her head, then slid into the bench across the booth from Gabrielle, who looked up with tear-stained cheeks and smiled at her friend. Becky said, "Hi. Hi yourself. You okay now?" "Yeah, for another year." "Gabrielle, I've been here with you for 6 years. You've never told me why you can't move on." "I've asked myself that exact same thing for 6 years, Becky. I was the only one who didn't get to say goodbye, to see him go. I'll not see him again to say it until I cross over, at the end of my life. I know it's stupid, but I want it. No needed to say goodbye. Trust me, Becky, it's getting easier to live life afterwards. But I am healing." Gabrielle smiled at her friend. "I'll see you tomorrow for breakfast," Becky remarked. "Gotta get home to my hubby." Getting up to leave, she went out the back door to where her truck was parked and left. Gabrielle sighed and allowed her head to fall into her hands, elbows on the table, tears flowing easily as she felt him with her once again. Sitting with her head in her hands, she didn't see the 2 drunken college boys come in to get a couple of 12 packs or that they noticed her. Bear was outside making sure the remaining 6 college rowdies all stayed in the truck, while Carla, the regular night shift girl, was watching the cash drawer and filling orders. The 2 Romeos staggered over and sat down with Gabrielle, one sliding in across from her, the other one next to her, moving his arm around her shoulders. He pulled her close to him. Startled, she gave out a cry. "What the hell do you want? Get your arm off of me. Get out of here and leave me alone." She was absolutely flabbergasted at the man's gall. The man across the table slurred out, "Ah, come on, honey. You don't need to cry over him. We'll make everything all better. Now quite playing hard to get." He winked at the guy who was still holding her. "First, get off of me." Poking the guy in the ribs, he moved his arm as she pushed him out of the booth and onto the floor. "Second, that is the worst Southern drawl and pickup line I've ever heard. Third, get out of here and leave me alone." Both men got real quiet. Then the guy who was sitting across from her snapped his hand and slapped her hard on her cheek. The unexpected move had Gabrielle back on her heels, so to speak, and she moved into the corner of the booth, her arms close to her body, her hands up near her face guarding. The man who had been deposited on the floor crawled back up from the floor, putting his knee on the booth seat. "So you like it rough, which, well, I like it rough too." He spit the words out like they were physical barbs, then lunged at Gabrielle. She screamed, "No." The man stopped inches from Gabrielle's face, then staring at her in obvious pain, mouth hanging open. No words coming from the evil-smelling canyon that now dominated his face. He seemed to be frozen in place. He slowly slid backwards to the end of the booth. The man let out a low groan of pain mixed with terror, whispering, "My balls, oh my God, he's got me by the balls." He lowered his head to the bench and just shook. Gabrielle looked up to see a tall man of average build. He had a gentle look in his eyes, she noticed as he met her gaze briefly. He smiled, then nodded back at her. He looked at the rapidly sobering man sitting across from her. The tall man's voice was firm but had a distinct edge to it. "Okay, boys. This lady has made it very clear she doesn't want your attention. Furthermore, she has asked you, not once, but twice, to leave her alone. So, I'll leave the gruesome details to your imagination if you decide to challenge. Now get lost." The stranger released his grasp, then slammed his fist back between his buddy's legs. The man lurched forward and slid down under the table, as a low, almost inaudible groan tumbled from his lips. The guy across the table from Gabrielle jumped up to grab the stranger, was met with a hard, well-placed left jab that landed on the bridge of his nose, splattering blood over both of the antagonists, as the drunk student fell limply back onto the bench. The stranger looked at Gabrielle. "Sorry about the mess, ma'am. It would probably be best if you got another seat after I escort our 2 guests out to their car." All Gabrielle could do was nod her head in agreement. The man gathered the 2 goons, then drug and pushed them to the bar, where they picked up the 2 12-packs of beer, then manhandled them to their awaiting truck. The boys took off out of the parking lot, only to be immediately pulled over by not 1, but 3 sheriff's cars. It seemed Carla made a phone call to alert them. When the man came back inside, Carla handed him a wet rag to clean himself off. He handed the cloth back when he was finished, nodding to the woman in thanks. He found that he had a friend sitting at his booth. "Gabrielle," she introduced herself, as she shook his hand. The man mumbled something that sounded like "Kenny," as he stared at her with big doe eyes. Gabrielle smiled. The man's gentleness disarmed her. She found him easy to talk to, and was amazed at how quickly he drew her in, as she ended up telling him all about Kirsten. He seemed amazed at the depth of commitment the 2 had for each other. When he said, "I am truly sorry for the loss all the people involved incurred," she didn't know why, but she felt he really meant it. As the bar closed down, Jebriel asked where his car was parked. He pointed to a late 90s model Mustang. She turned and asked Kinney if he would mind giving her a ride home. Her raw emotions coupled with the beer she had were too much to risk the drive. As they drove along, she pointed out the house where Kirsten had lived. Kinney studied the place with genuine interest. Surprisingly, he pulled into her parents' driveway before she told him where it was. He had walked her to her door when she politely asked, "Would you like to come in?" Standing off to the right side of the porch, with a sad faraway look in his eyes, he replied, "I don't think I'm allowed?" Jebriel stood by the front door a bit, dumbfounded by his answer, then noticed a tear running down his cheek. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, then sighed. "Well, do you like the way I would have looked? I guess this is about what I should have been like at our age now." She stared at the man in front of her. "What do you mean?" she asked, confusion apparent in her voice. The man looked at her, emotion readily apparent on his face as he gushed. "I have missed you so much, Grebs, and I didn't mean to leave you that night, especially without saying goodbye. I don't know what you did, but they sent me back for just a few brief spans of time, and that allotment is growing short. Oh my Grebs." The man both sighed and let out a soft sob. As he continued, "The Lord knows, I love you so much." An impossible hope sprang up in Jebriel as she saw the man in front of her for who he was. Moving quickly towards him, she grabbed him and fell into his embrace, then pulled him down to her, and her lips touched his. Both of them were lost in the moment. When they broke, she looked into his eyes. "Kirsten, it's really you. You're here holding me. How? How is that possible?" "I don't know, but I think it's so we can say a proper goodbye to each other. I didn't get to leave anything else for you, so," he grinned. The way Jebriel had always loved the little boy caught look. The night air, which had been hot and stifling, was suddenly cool and refreshing as she looked up at him. It suddenly occurred to her she had something very special to show to him. "Kirsten, I need to go get something. If I run inside to get it, will you still be here when I get back?" He thought and acted as if he were listening to something, then nodded yes and said, "Hurry." Jebriel flew into the house, opened her parents' bedroom door without knocking. Her mom and dad, who were both reading, looked up at their wild-eyed daughter. "No time to explain. Call Mom and Dad Tinnery. Tell them they have to get over here in the next 2 to 3 minutes. There is a miracle standing on our front porch. Hurry." As she left the room, her father grabbed the telephone. Something in her voice told him don't ask. After calling them, he and his wife scrambled out of their bed, threw on their robes, then headed downstairs. They saw their daughter fly out the front door in front of them. Now, why did she get him up, they wondered. Kirsten was stunned when Jebriel returned, the screen door slamming shut behind her. She was holding a child, a boy by the looks of him around 5 or 6. Kirsten noticed Grebs was shaking as she moved across the old banister front porch towards him. "It still needs painting," flickered across his mind. Jebriel sat down on the porch. The sleepy child hugged his mother. "You did leave me something, Kirsten. You left me our son, growing in my womb. And this beautiful little boy is Kirsten Winder Tinnery, your son, my love." "Our son." Kirsten was speechless, but then no more than Greb's parents, who had emerged from the house and were now standing on their porch, staring at a young man on their front porch that had been murdered 6 years ago that very night. Kirsten looked at both of them. "Could I have a hug? I need to say goodbye, and I don't have very long." Both of the Winders moved slowly past their daughter and grandson to face him. Mrs. Winder grabbed Kirsten, followed in short order by her husband. After a few moments in the embrace, Mrs. Winder remarked, "Now, my boy, go meet your son. He asks about you a lot." Kirsten nodded and knelt down in front of Jebriel and reached out a trembling hand to touch his son. The child looked up at the man in front of him. "Are you my real daddy?" Kirsten replied, "Yes, son. I am your daddy." Kirsten put out his arms, allowing his son to come to him for their first embrace. His son held him, smiling. "I prayed to God for a long time to send you back and help Mommy not to be sad anymore, so she can be happy like me. I know a bad man hurt you, and God has to have you in heaven so you won't hurt. I love you, Daddy, and I will take care of Mommy for you." Kirsten thought he sounded so grown up. He was very proud of his son. "My son, my precious child. I love you too, and I love your Mommy so very much. Thank you for taking care of her because I can't. But don't worry, I will watch over both of you, even when you can't see me or hear me. Now let me tell you a secret only we can know. Promise." "Promise," the child replied, making an exaggerated X over his little chest. Kirsten smiled and returned the gesture. "I promise you, when it's time for Mommy to go be with God, a long time from now, I will come to her and take her to heaven, okay?" "Okay, Daddy," came his proud answer. "Now I need you to go to Grandma and Grandpa, because I need to give your Mommy and my wife enough loving to last until the end of her life." Kissing each other, father and son separated with, "I love you," and "goodbye," exchanged for the last time this side of eternity. Grabbing his love, while still sitting on the porch, they both held on to each other, allowing the moment to fill them to the brim, feeling 2 more sets of arms enfold him. He looked up into the shocked faces. "Mama, Daddy," he said, as his parents were also allowed to partake of the miracle of a child's faith. For a few brief moments of time, Three families said the things to each other that are necessary for healing. Then at Kirson's insistence, final goodbyes spoken, hugs and kisses exchanged. Gabrielle took Kirson's hand and walked with him towards the road, knowing it would be their last walk for a while. Kissing her fiercely, Kirson took his love in his arms. Grebs, I want you to get out and experience life. All it has to give. Find the things you want to do. Go to the places you want to see. Find love, accept it in return. Give of yourself as much as you can. But remember, when it's all over, I'm coming to get you. And for a long time, we will share each other with just God, because I'm waiting for you. They kissed one last time, then looking deeply into each other's eyes, said goodbye. Gabrielle hugged him and closed her eyes. After she felt his arms go limp from around her, she stepped back away from him. A few moments later, she slowly opened her eyes, looking around, and he was gone. Sighing, she heard the door on the mailbox creak. Going over, she looked inside to find 6 envelopes, one addressed to each of the 6 people in the 2 families. No one would ever reveal to the others what he had written to them. No one ever asked. Gabrielle grabbed the letters. As she turned towards the house, she heard his voice on the wind near her ear. Goodbye. I love you, Grebs. A single tear fell down her cheek. I love you too, my Kirson. Thank you. Goodbye. She heard him sigh, and then the sounds of the night came rushing back into her mind. She stood and cried for a few minutes. Only there was no sadness, only joy. It filled her so completely, she had to let it out, and tears seemed so appropriate. Looking eastward, she saw the first light of the dawn of a brand new day break the horizon. Her heart was light, as were her footsteps. She turned and walked towards the house, ready to face a future that was suddenly bright with promise. Epilogue. 2 weeks after her 83rd birthday, Gabrielle lay in her hospital bed, her body failing, waiting patiently for her best friend to come and escort her to her new home. Her oldest child, Kirson, now 65, was in the room, talking and reading stories to his mom as she rested. He looked up as the door to the room opened to find his father standing there, looking much as he remembered him from all those years before. Kirson stood. His dad said, "Hi. Sorry you can't hug me. I don't have a physical body for this trip." "I understand, Dad. Thanks for watching out for your mom for me. I love you for it all the more." "You're welcome, Dad. I want to know something. Will you?" The embarrassment shone on his face. "Son, we will both come back for you and your lovely bride. But right now your mom and I have a date, so tell her goodbye." Mother and son said their piece to each other. Returning to his seat near the window, he watched as his father moved over by the bed. Kirson looked at Gabrielle. He had a huge smile on his face. "You ready?" "Yes, love. I've waited patiently for you, for such a long time." Taking his best friend by her hand, Kirson gently pulled Gabrielle up from the bed towards himself. Their son watched in awe as a spirit of his mother stood from within her body. She looked to be 20 years old. The 2 lovers embraced, said goodbye to their child. Then they slipped out the door as the cardiac monitors blared their trumpet call, another person freed to eternity. Kirson sat in the chair in the corner of the room as the hospital staff made a valiant effort to save the old woman. The doctor finally said, "It's too late." Kirson distinctly heard, "Grebs, wait up," followed by, "Well, hurry up, slowpoke," and the laughter of little children as they run through the meadows on hot summer days fading away in the distance. Kirson smiled, gathered his things to go sign the appropriate paperwork, make the phone calls to his 3 half-siblings, then get home and try to explain this to his wife. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.